Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for supporting the show. You can find out more about the show, hear episodes, read Clay's blogs at jeffersonhour.com. You can find out about his upcoming cultural tours, all sorts of stuff. And again, thank you for listening and supporting the show. So pleased this week to be joined by Joe Ellis. It's been a while since he's been on the show. We're so glad to hear that he's recovering from his recent surgery. And he came on the show to talk about David McCullough, who recently passed. And it was great to hear the two of you share stories about him, Clay.
Well, I should say that I barely knew David McCullough and looked up to him from a much lower plateau than Joe. Joe knew him well. They had conversations. They met at different times. They debated American history, particularly John Adams. And so it was great to listen to Joe talk about this extraordinary public historian. And I think the point that Joe made, which is so important, is that David wrote for the American people. He didn't write for fellow academics. And fellow academics sometimes grumble about that. But David believed that his mission was to speak to the American people, to tell the story of America in a way that would help people think about the past and maybe make better choices for the future. And many academics sneer at that idea and believe that that's a sellout, or that's mere popularization, or that's derivative history or synthetic history. I couldn't disagree more. Both Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt believed that historians have a duty to write for a broad public. And remember that Jefferson said, if you expect to be a nation ignorant and free, you expect what never has been and never can be. And so people like McCullough, and to a very large extent Joe Ellis and others, write for a broad public. And I think they're doing an extraordinary national service in doing so. And a point I made during the program was that if people who are listening to this right now would just read the complete works of David McCullough, they would have a wonderful grounding in the broad sweep of our national experiment from before 1776 until today.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think to a lesser extent, but certainly it's there. Ellis's writing does do that. I have to apologize, too. I stepped on one of your lines during the show, if you recall, and that was, I wrote a book about that.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of went past him, but it was a fun conversation.
Well, that's, that you point to the fact that whenever we have these conversations with Joe, I always put up a stopwatch to see how many minutes it takes for him to say, I wrote a book about that. And he's not boasting. Yeah. It's just matter of fact. He's written an extraordinary number of really important books. The difference between McCullough and our friend Joe Ellis is twofold. Number one, Joe's concentration is on the founding in the early national period. He's not interested in Andrew Jackson or Abraham Lincoln or the World War I.
The Johnstown Flood.
Right. And the second thing is that Joe Ellis was an academic, McCullough not, and Joe needed and wanted academic respect and got it. So he's a really interesting crossover figure who has written books that other academics approve of, not universally, but mostly, and yet the public can read his books without dictionaries and without tearing their hair out. And so Joe has really done an extraordinary thing in the middle. And if you think about it, there are very few historians who have that capacity. So we're lucky, very lucky to have him. And when he starts talking about historians he has known, or books that he has written, or books he might still write, or his formation as a writer, I just want to listen, because I can't tell our audience how privileged they are and we are, and truly honored late in his career to have a good deal of access to one of the most important historians of our time. And you couldn't have asked for that. You couldn't, if we had 15 years ago, if we had tried to do this, we wouldn't have been able to do it, because we didn't have enough breadth then or stature. And someone like Joe Ellis was still at the height of his productivity and wasn't going to be able to spare time for a couple of knuckleheads on the Great Plains of North Dakota. And so, this is one of the gifts that the pandemic gave to us. And it dates before the pandemic, but he made himself available in part because he and his wife Ellen were stuck in in a second home in Vermont trying to avoid the plague.
That all may be true, or not. I'm not certain. Anyway, I am so glad that Joe came back. It's always great to listen to the two of you talk. Let's go to the show. Before we do you have anything you want to pitch or let people know about?
Just that we're going to Greece next fall of 2023. People should sign on, and we're also doing the Salmon River, not the annual Lewis and Clark trip, but a related Lewis and Clark trip, or a float on the Salmon River next summer in the heart of the summer. So people should go to the website and see what we're doing, look for that. And if they want to do a little drinking game, you can have a shot every time that Joe Ellis mentions Mao Zedong in this conversation.
All right, let's go to the show. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, my friend.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. And we kind of stretch that boundary from time to time. This week, we're so glad to welcome back a good friend of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Dr. Joseph Ellis. And I believe, Clay, you are on the line too, are you not, sir?
Welcome back, Joe. We've missed you, and our listeners miss you. I understand you've had a little bit of surgery in the last few weeks.
I have. I got laid out with lower back surgery, but I'm doing well.
So we're glad to have you back, and I think we have a full agenda for today's program. So, David, take it away.
David McCullough passed on, and I immediately thought of you, Joe, and tried to call you and had the wrong number, and you were involved in recovery, and so we finally got a chance to talk about that. But I have such respect for that man, and I was hoping that the two of you might kind of reflect on his career. He's probably best known to Americans from 1990 when he became this immortal voice of Ken Burns' Civil War. And I remember hearing that and going, who is that guy? What a voice. But did either you have any personal recollections that you'd like to share about him?
Well, I'll go first if it's okay with you, Clay. I was friends with David. We did some things together. The most important was we testified before a subcommittee of the House for the construction of a memorial to Abigail and John Adams on the Mall. And he was great in that moment. And he brought the prestige of his work in the Pact. But I would actually say that only one person, Ken Burns, has influenced more Americans and made them more aware of what their history was and is than our man. And his body of work is extraordinarily impressive. And yet, at the moment, the profession, the historical profession, has tended to denigrate his work because it doesn't pay sufficient attention in their mind to the downside of American history, slavery, the failure to resolve the Native American issue. I think that those people are not in touch with the American public in the way that David was. And I think that there ought to be, I was thinking of calling up Ken Burns and saying, Ken, I think you should do a special called The Work of David McCullough, or The Vision of David McCullough for America. And Lord knows, in this divided, sometimes vitriolic political environment, we need to be able to talk about things that bring us together in our understanding of who we are as a people and a nation. And I think David had an instinct for that. Finally, at one point in time, he called me up and said, Joe, I was thinking of writing a joint biography of Jefferson and Adams. And I've been working on it for 6 months. And I don't like Jefferson. Now, this is on Jefferson Hour, I'm telling you this. And he disappointed in Jefferson. And he thought he would just do a biography of Adams, which is what he ended up doing, which won the Pulitzer. And he said to me, because I had written an earlier book on Adams, he said, that had to some extent caught his attention. And he said, Joe, do I have your permission to write a biography of John Adams? I said, for God's sakes, David, you don't need my permission. Of course, go do it, baby. And which he did. And that also became the basis for the really brilliant film series. I think it was HBO series on the Adams family, that were Adams. And at any rate, at a time in American history when we're fighting about the meaning of the American past with great at times, as I said, vitriol. I think he is a voice that needs to be remembered and I'm hoping that somebody like Ken Burns can help us do that. And right now on this show, at least we're initiating that possible conversation.
Joe, I share an experience with you. I actually was in a congressional subcommittee testifying about the future of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the night before I had dinner with the great David McCullough because he was testifying too, and so it was a great honor to be in his presence, but also then to be with him on in front of a group of congressmen who some of whom were not favorable to the future of the NEH. He wrote great books. I think of Truman, his biography of Harry Truman, his Path Between the Seas about the building of the Panama Canal. You mentioned the John Adams book, which was going to be a joint biography until he discovered that he really liked Adams and not so much
Well, he
Jefferson.
also early did this book on the Brooklyn Bridge, which was the inspiration for Ken Burns' first film on the Brooklyn Bridge, as a matter of fact.
And he did Mornings on Horseback about young Theodore Roosevelt. That book, Mornings on Horseback, has been enormously influential. It's actually, his theory has a little bit been reformed or discredited. His view was that Roosevelt's asthma was psychosomatic or partly psychosomatic, and it had to do with his parentage and so on. But at any rate, here's this person who's written 15 or 20 important books, who won all the prizes, the immortal voice of the Civil War series, but also, he's an old style historian. He's really a 20th century historian. Maybe that's why the hotheads in the universities are going after him a little bit. But when I wrote a little piece about him after his death, I tried to reckon who's the last historian who works with a typewriter. Almost everybody today has made his.
That might be Joe Ellis.
Well, Joe Ellis is pre-typewriter. I write everything by hand, and David, you're right. David's famous for his old typewriter there, and he had a little cottage outside his house on Nantucket, I guess it was, and he came banging away. But I agree with what you just said, Clay, about 20th century historian of sorts. His work will live longer than the work of many other historians who are only writing to each other, as a matter of fact. David's instinct as a writer was to understand the world through the perspective of the person he's writing about. And that's whether it's Adams or Truman or down the road. But that he doesn't step outside that and develop a critique of the person. His goal is to render as a witness the vision of that prominent figure, and he does a great job at that. He's really good at exteriors. I used to say I'm better at interiors, but I don't know whether that's true. But what the ship was like when Adams got on it, and he can recreate, in effect, the way it looked, but always through the eyes of the person he's writing about. And that tradition in biography goes pretty far back, and one that I think he's an important embodiment of. And we just need to keep talking about him right now, because his passing creates that opportunity. And above and beyond all that, he was a really decent human being. He never engaged in that kind of sharpshooting that sometimes afflicts the academy. So he wasn't jealous of other people's work. He had the confidence of a man who believed in what he was doing, and in that sense, he's a role model, in my view, of what the profession needs to have more of.
Agreed.
He himself was not a trained historian. He graduated from Yale, and his first job was working for Sports Illustrated, and then he started working for American Heritage, and that's when he really got into the writing of American history. But for that very reason, he never learned academese. And his writing is accessible to a larger readership in a way that many scholarly works are not.
Agreed. A couple of quick things before we take our first break here. Number one, he extraordinarily generous and decent man. Number two, I see him as a narrative historian more than an analytical historian. And I think that he was trying to put you in the scene and he was trying to tell the story. And I think a lot of academics sneer at that sort of thing and regard it as beneath their notice. But that's what the public needs and wants. And I think that he shares with Ken Burns a real respect for the American public and a belief that they're up to understanding their history, but that history needs to be told without jargon and without postmodern tropes and intellectual apparatus. That if you just tell the story using the documents as carefully as you can, that's the first step in our national understanding of ourselves. And I think you're the kind of pivotal figure, however, Joe. So he's a public historian, not an academic. Then there are academics on the other end of the spectrum who write monographs that nobody reads. Maybe 6 people read and they're all gunning for them. You're sort of standing in the middle of all that. You're an academic, but you chose at some early point in your career that you were going to write both for your fellow historians and for a broader public. And that takes some courage.
Well, it didn't take courage for me because that's the only thing I knew how to do. Though I decided to stay at a liberal arts college for 40 years because that kind of teaching forces you to be in touch with undergraduates and not just be producing graduate students and to expand your horizon. I used to teach a course on foreign policy. I taught a course called Back to the Future, the History of Prophecy, lots of things like that. You would have never been allowed to do that at a research university. But that David and I shared that commitment to the definition of our public audience. I'll stop there. But I think that his passing provides an occasion for us to talk about why American history is too important to be left to historians.
We need to take a short break, gentlemen, in just a minute here, but just to echo what the two of you have said, the critic John Leonard of the New York Times described him as saying, "We have no better social historian."
The professor will not agree with that. He's not a social, but it depends on the term social historian in the academic world means a discussion of ordinary Americans and not the elite. And that's not what he did. He did the elites, but he also, I guess, David transcended those kind of definitions. He was a historian of the human experience as it took shape in this place called the United States.
With that, we shall take a short break, but we will return in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, a discussion with Clay Jenkinson and Joseph Ellis. And Joe, we're so glad to have you back and so glad to hear that you're recovering from your recent surgery and you can get out and walk those 2 dogs shortly, but but we're going to keep you a little longer if we might. We were talking about David McCullough, and the one book that you guys, neither one of you mentioned that I really enjoyed. It's a short book, but it's a great book. Is 1776. And
oh yeah.
As both of you are authors, you will appreciate this. Its initial printing was 1.25 million copies.
Wow. Yeah. That's a huge audience.
Yeah.
I remember talking to him about that when he was writing that, and I pressed him to try to expand the meaning of 76 to the political as well as the military side of the story. And he said no, that they can both be handled through primarily a discussion of Washington and the military campaigns. It is, if you want to know about what, it is a very good narrative history of what happened in that year from the point of view of Washington and the Continental Army. That's what it is.
Joe, let me ask you one quick question about the achievement of David McCullough. When I pick up a new book, I always look to the index. I look to something that I know about Lewis and Clark, or about Jefferson, or about Edward S. Curtis, or J. Robert Oppenheimer, and then I go read those pages, because if I like how he or she treated those pages and feel that they were accurate and compelling, then I have confidence in the book. So probably nobody is in a better position to assess David McCullough's John Adams than you are, and so you must have read it. We can't help but read this knowing that in some sense you are rivals in the historical field, and that he's talking about something that you are one of the great experts on. Were there things in the John Adams book that you shook your head at, or would have quibbled with him in a lovely way over dinner?
Yeah, which we did once. We were together at something in Washington and we had dinner, but we'd like to argue about that. And he was open to that. What I said to him is that there is this contrarian side to Adams, and he really was tortured in many respects, and that there's that you don't get at that as much as I think you should. And I mean, I'm a fan of it, but we both are fans of Adams, and that's not what most people with regard to Adams would say, but that essentially the publication of the Adams papers, especially the family correspondence between Abigail and John, exposes him more fully than any other of the founders. And what David did do is use that source. We know more about John Adams and Abigail Adams than we do about any other prominent couple in American history, and he used that. I wanted him to press a little bit harder on Abigail, and her role and the quality of her writing. Yeah, she's actually a better letter writer than John, and John said that. But that I was developing a slightly critical perspective on Adams within an overall loving appreciation of the guy, and pressing David to do a little more with that. It didn't, but it's still a great biography, and deserved the awards it received. But his willingness to engage on that is a measure, again, of his own mentality. It's not a closed mentality.
Let me jump in and just say, didn't you write a book about that, Joe?
About John Adams, or about Abigail and John?
Yes.
Yeah, I read a book called First Family after his, and so you could read his book, and then you can read mine. You can see there's difference. We both love Adams. We do. We think he's the most fully revealed of all the founders. But there's this moment in Paris when both Abigail and John are at a play of Othello. Abigail comes back and she says to John, and she tells him this to her sister in a letter, that when she watched the scene when Othello kisses Desdemona, she felt revulsion, and it was a racist reaction. And she's honest about it. She's saying, I didn't like that. And I said, David, you should deal with that. You should use that. He didn't do that. And he didn't want to get into that. Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book called Passionate Sage, which in fact, David said is the book that first interested him in Adams. And that's the reason he started working on him. So instead of being competitive with regard to this, we were like two brothers, arguing about what the family really is. And I had enormous respect for what he did. I think he did for me too. But there is a revival, and even in the academic profession, on Adams. I mean, Adams used to be sort of a third-rate figure. He's now in the pantheon, way up there, and that's because his papers allow us to understand him in a way more fully than any other person. When like George Washington, you read his diary, last day of his presidency, you wonder what the hell he's thinking. His diary says, April 7th, 1797, a day like all days, 33 degrees Fahrenheit. You read Adams, and he's talking about the weather too, but he's not talking about the weather outside. He's talking about the weather inside his own soul and the storms he feels inside there. And they're so different in terms of their temperaments. But I'm more naturally drawn to Adams, and so, for that matter, it was David.
Before we move on from David McCullough, I must go back to where I started, and that is his narration of Ken Burns' Civil War series. In my career, I spent a lot of time recording people's voices, and there are those who will read a paragraph and you say, what did you just read? And they don't know. And then there are guys like McCullough who is talking directly to you, and he's not reading anything. He's telling you a story, and it's just so effective. Beyond his work as an author, his voice work is just stellar, I think.
It is, and like the last scene in the Civil War series, which I really think is Burns' best series of all time, came early in his career, and he's reading from that letter that the Union officer writes back to his wife, and we know he's going to die the next day. That is so compelling, and David's voice is almost like God's talking to you. David also was the narrator in the very, very good movie. It had nothing to do with American history. Well, it did a little bit with Seabiscuit. He was sort of in the same way Walter Cronkite was to news. As soon as you hear his voice, you say, "Oh, that's the voice of authority. That's coming to us from some region above that's got wisdom." And I don't have any of that, and he had that.
Clay, I'll give you the last word, and then I want to move on to another subject, if I might.
Of course. Well, I've just so enjoyed listening to Joe talk about this. Joe knew him in a way that I didn't. They both had reputations as being eminent historians of America. McCullough ranged more widely than Joe. He picked topic, Kitty Hawk and Americans in Paris and the Panama Canal.
Johnstown Flood.
I think that was his first book. And he's a generalist, and a generalist does great work for the country. I mean, if you just read McCullough's complete works, if you started tomorrow and read the complete works of David McCullough, including his essays, which I love too, you would have a very, very good grounding in the main lines of American history. There would be gaps, of course, but he would be the first to acknowledge that. But you couldn't go wrong. If you wanted to do a course in McCullough, it couldn't be contained within a semester at one of our major universities. It would take a full year. But you would, at the end of this, have a really deep understanding of the narrative line of American history. And I think that's an extraordinary achievement. He will be much missed. And I think that in some sense, he made Ken Burns as much as Ken Burns featured him.
Oh, yeah, I agree. He had a line that he used a couple times with me that was really great. He came out of his Johnstown Flood book, but he said, whenever there was something that a major figure said that he thought was ridiculous, he said, that's like blaming the Johnstown Flood on a leaky toilet in Altoona. I thought that was a great line.
Gentlemen, a couple of weeks ago on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, we aired a conversation, show 1509, Tear It Up. And it was a conversation between Clay Jenkinson and Bo Breslin. And it was about, it kind of went back to Jefferson, who gave the Constitution 19 years. I was hoping the two of you might discuss that a bit more. Clay, can you set that up for us?
I'd love to. So Bo Breslin is at Skidmore College, and he's written a book called The Constitution for the Living, imagining how 5 generations of Americans would rewrite the nation's fundamental law. And I was just scanning around on Amazon or some site, and I saw the title, and I thought, wow, somebody finally somewhere has taken Jefferson's idea seriously and tried to sort of figure out what that might have looked like. And so I said, I want to know about this. I ordered the book. I enjoyed the book very much, so I contacted Bo Breslin, and he graciously said he's a fan of the Jefferson Hour, but he graciously agreed to be interviewed, and we talked, Joe, about what it would have been had we taken this notion that each generation is not only entitled to write its own social compact, but in some sense must write it to avoid the straitjacketing of a constitution that winds up being a problem rather than an enabler of national greatness. And
that show really generated a lot of email from our listeners. But for those of them that didn't hear it, this kind of comes from a letter that I believe Jefferson wrote to Madison in 1789. Can you explain that?
87 from Paris, right?
When Madison got the letter, he probably had a heart attack because he just spent the preceding months trying to lead the country through this thing called the Constitutional Convention and getting the compromises and everything necessary to make that work. And here's Jefferson telling him that this should only last for 19 or 20 years and then we should redo it. That every generation has to have its own constitution. And Madison wrote him back and said, generations don't come into the world as wholes. They're
on a single day,
and that you can't easily say that each generation is sovereign because it doesn't exist as a sovereign unit. And again, it's one of the brilliant ideas of Jefferson that's totally impractical, but it's nevertheless brilliant. I would also say that if by some miracle you could bring all the founders back, to include Jefferson and Madison, and tell them that, 240 years later, we still with the same Constitution, they would be astounded. Madison said once when asked in old age in 1829, how long he thought the Constitution would last, and he said at best 100 years. So that would have meant 1929. And there are so many features of the Constitution that they recognized as weak, and one of which is the Electoral College. But I, as a person who's read all their papers, and that's my only major achievement, I guess, is that if you brought them back, they would say, let's have another constitutional convention. We got to do away with the Electoral College, this thing called the filibuster. What in God's name is that thing that you created? The Senate itself is not representative and needs to be totally redone. Yet, if you say you want to do that, it can't work. The reason the Constitution worked is because it was done in total secrecy with the gathering of all white males. If you tried to do anything like that now, of course, it would be regarded as illegitimate. So trying to imagine the current American society creating another constitutional convention, well, it's impossible to imagine. And yet, without doubt, the engine needs to be totally rehauled. And in that sense, I agree with the man from Skidmore that engaging in a discussion of what we need to do in this regard is something that needs to happen.
Well, let me just say a couple of things about the conversation. He was terrific, and we focus more on our current situation maybe than Andrew Jackson and the build-up to the Civil War and the coming of Theodore Roosevelt. So in other words, he sort of semi-fictionalizes, but fact-based, what might have been at stake in each of those constitutional conventions, and tries to say, could a convention in the 1850s have wrestled slavery to the ground? Could in the 60s we have wrestled civil rights to the ground? I mean, if you did that, if you took Jefferson seriously and you could overcome the problems that you rightly point to, Joe, but if you could actually assemble 55 or 550 people that were much more representative of the nation than the 55 founders in Philadelphia, and you could give them the background and the time and the security to do this, could those periodic reassessments of the American social compact have solved the problems that seem to be intractable, or would it be the same thing that happened in 1787, which is that they kicked the can down the road on slavery, and they kicked the can down the road on a range of other questions, big states and little states, and North v. South, and how much democracy can the people really stand? But so it was really an interesting conversation. But let me just put it this way: think of the way that the Second Amendment has become a kind of a national suicide pact. That we're stuck with this thing, and now it authorizes an AR-15 or more.
So the irony of that is, and I've written about this in a book called American Dialogue, the Second Amendment, the term bear arms doesn't mean own and carry a gun. It means own and carry a gun in a military unit. And the Scalia interpretation in his D.C. versus Heller decision is not in keeping what the founders intended in the Second Amendment. And all of the Supreme Court precedents up till that decision in D.C. versus Heller said that. And so that I'd say to people, I know it makes them mad, but you don't really have Second Amendment rights. You've got NRA rights. Scalia writes. So that's a distortion of the founders. But the interesting thing is that all the founders that I know of would argue that the people who think that the Constitution is enshrined in some kind of sacred wrapping, that it can't be touched, none of them would agree with that. And they wouldn't go as far as Jefferson that say that everything has to be redone every 20 years. That they would recognize that this document that they created is an anachronism in many respects now, and that it's strange from their point of view that it's being retained in part because that their own generation has been mythologized, and they didn't want that. They didn't want that.
I have a comment and then a question, and my comment, so please hold your reaction, Joe, is that the 250th birthday of the United States is coming in 2026, and the culture war is going to heat up in a way that we haven't seen for a long, long time between those who say we can do no right and those who say we can essentially do no wrong. And my suggestion is that we do have a constitutional convention in 2026. It might only be a play acting. In other words, it might not have full constitutional validity, but the best thing we could do would be to really try to renew the American social compact in a significant way as a way of paying deep respect to what the founders gave us. I don't expect that to happen, but that's my view, and I think it would be an infinitely better 250th birthday of the United States than the nightmare thing that I think is coming. But here's my question for you, Joe. It's a serious question. If we had taken Jefferson seriously, and if we had done something along the lines of what Bo Breslin is positing here, could we have wrestled some fundamental questions to the ground? In other words, could it work? Are there things we can't do because we're stuck in the paradigm of this Constitution? If we got out from it and looked at the Electoral College and looked at the makeup of the Senate and looked at a whole range of other things, the impeachment clause, the pardon clause, the emoluments clause, etc. If we actually tried to do that in a significant way, could we renew and reform?
Joe, I'm going to ask you to hold that answer. We need to take a short break, but when we come back, I'll give you an opportunity. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour with our returning champion, Dr. Joseph Ellis, at an undisclosed location in Vermont. I think actually now that's your home in Vermont, but leaving that aside.
We're temporarily back in our old house as the place up in Vermont gets worked on and expanded a bit, but I'm in Amherst, Massachusetts right now.
All right. So here's the question I asked as we went to break. Could it work? Could Jefferson's plan of periodic generational renewal of the Constitution, so you can get rid of the fossils, the 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave clause, etc., and acknowledge that women are a part of our national polity, and that Native Americans are part of our polity, that African Americans have not only been emancipated but are full-on citizens, and so on. If you got rid of all the fossils, but also then said, what are the 4 or 5 problems that are really holding us back in our national experiment? Could this work, Joe?
Short answer, no. It is a typical, in some sense, Jeffersonian utopian idea. And it makes a lot of sense at a stratospheric level. But once you go to the ground, especially the ground in the United States in this moment, or in this period of our history, it would be the victim of the very forces it seeks to change. I would make an alternative suggestion about the celebration of the Revolution in a few years in 2026. And it makes a great deal of sense for a program like the Jefferson Hour. There are 2 founding moments. Scholars who talk about the American founding, of legal scholars especially, are always talking about the Constitution. I think that there's another founding that occurs in 76, and the founding document there is the Declaration. And that the conversation that we need to have is the conversation about the words that Jefferson wrote and what they mean to us now. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To some extent, the culture wars are being fought over the meaning of those words now. Do those words mean that women are totally equal, not just in terms of votes, but patriarchy itself needs to go? Do those words mean that all people, regardless of race, creed, or sexual orientation, are equal? Those are the values that a portion of the American public in the Trump age are rejecting. And in some sense, it is Jefferson's voice and Jefferson's words, believe it or not, that can allow us to come together and debate what those words mean. Jefferson didn't mean that women should be equal. He didn't believe in that. Jefferson didn't believe that blacks should be equal. But that's what the words actually say, regardless of what he thought they meant. And what I think they've come to mean for a certain, that's at least in some sense, the debates about when you say make America great again, what you're saying is you want to turn the clock back before a black president, before the Voting Rights Act, and that in some sense, what we're arguing about is what the core principles of the American Revolution are. And those are the revolution sets the moral agenda for the nation. And that's what needs to be discussed right now.
Well, I have more optimism than you. I'm a Jeffersonian, of course. And
yes, I know. Well, that's the reason we can argue so productively.
The utopian streak in Jefferson greatly appeals to me. I think that Jefferson's fundamental principle is the right one, that a great people must renew itself in a fundamental way from time to time. You know, he was looking at the fall of the Roman Republic.
You know who else made that argument? Mao.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, he did.
Let me jump in from the other side
Joe.
of it. You're optimistic about all this, Clay, but you know it's that careful what you wish for. Why do you think that a rewritten Constitution would be better? And there's a faction of Americans now that want to take away people's rights. I don't think they look at it that way, but in fact, that's what's happening. I mean, why do you think a constitutional convention would provide something that's better? Sorry to be a pessimist.
People step up. When I watched the first impeachment of President Trump, they had several constitutional scholars from around the country providing a little seminar to the United States Senate on what was at stake. It was one of the greatest things I've ever seen from a civics point of view. I think you could do it. I think the people are up to it. I think the people would really wrestle with the Second Amendment and the Electoral College and the pardon clause and the makeup of the Senate and so on. You'd have to have some safeguards, of course. This is not 1787. People aren't reading their Polybius and their Plutarch. People don't know Latin. People haven't read their Montesquieu. They don't really even understand maybe what a social compact means. But this is a national educational process, which is why I think we should do it for the 250th birthday of the country. Yeah, it might be a terrible disaster. Joe is probably right. I don't think that Mao really needs to be part of this. Now you're going to say Pol Pot. I mean, for goodness sakes, Joe.
I mean to say that example, and Mao did call for a revolution every generation to clean out the arterial system of the society when plaque builds up inside it, which is very Jeffersonian in its view. And the net result, of course, is the death of several 100 million Chinese people.
That ain't going to happen here, but I think we're up to it.
I'm not making a comparison between Jefferson and Mao.
Well, you sort of are, yeah.
Let's move on from that. Let me quote an article in the New York Times written by Jesse Wigman. He quotes Aziz Rana, who says, "We have an amendment process that's the hardest in the world to enact. That's the reason why it's basically a dead letter to enact constitutional amendments." It goes on to say that out of almost 12,000 amendments proposed since the founding, only 27 have been adopted.
10 right off the top, of course, and the last one in 1992, a full generation ago, more than Jefferson's 19 years. So the amendment process has utterly paralyzed. But the last one in 1992 was frivolous. It was about salaries of congressmen. So we haven't had a fundamental constitutional amendment since the 1970s. That's not the formula. You want the bar to be high so that there are no frivolous amendments, but you don't want it to be so high that there can never be another amendment. And that's where we are right now.
But the
so
founders intended that amendments were going to fix that. I found a quote from Gouverneur Morris years after the Constitutional Convention. He wrote, "Surrounded by difficulties, we did the best we could, leaving it with those who should come after us to take counsel from experience and exercise prudently the power of amendment." But that really hasn't happened.
That was Washington's view. That was Jefferson's view. That was Gouverneur Morris's view. That was Madison's view. But it ain't happening because we don't have the wherewithal to build a national consensus to get 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states to ratify. Look at the fate of the Equal Rights Amendment, and that sort of tells you where we are with this. So we need to lower that bar a little. That would be maybe the best thing we could do, is lower the bar to 55% and 2/3 of the states or something, and see what happens with it, because I don't think we're going to get a range of frivolous amendments. Do you, Joe?
No. I mean, remember, in 1787, the total population of the United States was smaller than current Los Angeles.
4 million.
It was gathered along the Atlantic coast between the Appalachians and the Atlantic, so that we're so much bigger. And the size of the republic was always something that concerned them. I mean, a nation-sized republic had never existed before. But what we mean by nation now is so much larger, so much more populous, so much more racially and otherwise varied, that it's just a fundamentally different kind of society. And the Congress is and especially the Senate is a graveyard for legislation. It's a place where things don't happen, and it will, and the people that occupy the Senate will destroy or will block anything. By the way, without question, in my view, the current filibuster is unconstitutional, literally unconstitutional. The Constitution specifies 4 issues in which a majority vote or a supermajority of the vote of the Senate is required. That is, go to war, approve a foreign treaty, pass a constitutional amendment, or overturn a presidential veto. All other legislation was and must be only majority vote. So it's not the filibuster per se, it's the doctrine of cloture, which allows one senator to stop a bill and require a 60-vote majority. I believe that itself, you don't have to change the Constitution. You just have to say the Constitution itself doesn't permit that.
Huh.
Nobody else that I heard have said that, so there must be something wrong with what I'm saying, but I'd like the audience to consider it.
I agree with Joe Ellis on this point, that the cloture, the requirement that significant legislation needs 60 votes to get to to be passed in the United States Senate is A, unconstitutional, and B, a straitjacket that's going to destroy this country. So the founding fathers wanted to distill the will of the people in several different ways. The House would be one distillation, not the best of them. The Senate would be a better distillation. The president would have his capacity to veto. The courts would have their power to advise and possibly provide a judicial veto or judicial requirement for revision. All of these were ways to distill the will of the country and to refine it and to make it pure, or as pure as it could ever be in a republic, and to take away from the Senate the simple procedure of majority rule, which was intended in 99% of all cases by the framers of the Constitution, is one of the worst things that we've ever done. Both sides are afraid of the majority of the other, but it has prevented us from doing things that would have made this a much more progressive, much more democratic country, and we need to adjust that before we do anything else.
Do either one of you know the history of that, how that procedure began?
the filibuster has an origin in the early 19th century, and its traditional function, it was primarily based in the South. It was a way to protect slavery and to avoid slavery coming up for discussions in the Congress or in the Senate. And then in the 19th and 20th century becomes the way in which segregationists prevent discussion of right to vote and black rights. So it's got a pretty ignoble history. The creation of cloture under the guise of a merely procedural change, they made a constitutional change. Cloture, that came into existence, I think, and I'm not sure about this, in the late 70s, early 80s.
Cloture began in 1917 when the Senate was at war with Woodrow Wilson and adopted a new rule establishing cloture, which allowed the Senate to end debate with a 2/3 vote, etc. And so cloture begins as a way of preventing. It began as a positive thing to prevent endless debate. It winds up being what it is now. So
I think the form in which it's taken
comes to the 70s.
They has achieved a different kind of meaning more recently.
Yeah, and in 1975, the Senate reduced the number of votes required for cloture from 2/3 to 3/5. So that's when we got to 60.
Yeah, why the hell do we need a Senate anyway? I mean, I know that's a really radical idea, but to think about it, when the founders created the Senate, they were thinking they were creating an American version of the House of Lords, where in the House of Lords it was the elite that were part of a royal or privileged class, but that in the American Senate it was supposed to be a natural aristocracy, the best and the brightest. And certainly that's what the Senate was supposed to be, and yet it's the exact opposite now. So why the hell do we need a Senate?
I got to ask this question before we run out of time. You know, this notion that cloture may be unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is.
Clay?
Well, yes and no. The Constitution grants the Congress, both houses, the right to set the terms of their procedures, and so probably it would be a rough go. I do agree that it's spiritually unconstitutional.
I say that under the guise, it does. The Constitution specifies that Senate has a right to write its own rules. But that's meaning, what kind of committees they have. But what the cloture is not just a procedural change, that under the guise of a procedural or purely parliamentary change, they are making a constitutional change. And that's the reason I think it violates the real meaning of the Constitution.
I agree that it certainly is a violation of the spirit of the Constitution. And guess who wrote the first Senate manual? Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson, that's right. He didn't have anything else to do when he was vice president, so he redid the rules of order. That's
unlike Adams, he wasn't inventing titles of nobility or wearing a ceremonial sword.
That's true. Anyway, I think that the kind of discussion and debate we're having now is something that needs to be, I think, more widespread in the society. And when the anniversary of the American Revolution happens, I have a fear, Clay, that your prediction that it's going to turn into a circus is likely to be true. It's very un-Jeffersonian of you to think that, by the way. And but that it also is an opportunity for some portion of the populace and some portion of the people who are interested in American history to try to move it in a more constructive direction. And I have some hope. Ken Burns is working on a film on the American. There come my dogs. I'm sorry.
Yeah, time to take them for a walk. And
Ken Burns is working on a film that is going to come out on the American Revolution. Maybe he can help us with this.
I hear those dogs, and that means it's time for you to take them to a walk. And actually, we're about out of time for this week. Any last words from either of you, sir?
I'm happy, and I think the dogs are telling us exactly what we need to hear. It's time to go.
Well, it's great for you. It's great to hear your voice, Joe, and I'm so glad that you've recovered, and let's talk again sooner than later.
Words of my demise were vastly exaggerated. Who said that?
It was Mark Twain who said rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. So, Joe, two things as we close. Enjoy your dogs, of course. The back surgery has obviously made you feisty. Maybe it affected your brain pan. But I want to quote one thing for you as we go. The differences between friends cannot but reinforce their friendship. Who said that?
I don't know. That sounds
Chairman Mao. So, so back off on Mao Zedong.
Well, you're the one bringing him in here on a good issue, as a matter of fact. And Jefferson and Mao agreed on the principle: a revolution every generation is a good thing.
Let's leave it at that for the moment. This is our dear friend Joseph Ellis. We want you back again soon. Congratulations on all that's going on in your life. And we'll see all of you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.